So just to sort of, motivate this idea that in psychology, there's this view that potentially a lot of what we do in our day-to-day life is a result of our habits. Our habits kind of make us who we are. And the basic idea behind what a habit is that actions can be self-reinforcing. So if you undertake an activity, it can increase your desire to undertake that activity in the future. And so what we're going to do in this paper is examine the possibility of habit formation for core economic behavior, which is labor supply. And if there is habit formation labor supply, why might that be important? Well, it has like a ton of potentially important implications for labor markets. So for example, one of the very long standing puzzles and observations in macroeconomics is that labor markets tend to exhibit hysteresis. So where transitory shocks to employment can have persistent effects. So for example, there's like a downturn, like a recession, unemployment goes up, people lose their jobs. And then even though the economy recovers, employment levels don't seem to recover. And we saw that after the Great Recession in the US, we saw that after the pandemic, where a lot of people just decided, I'm just going to exit the labor market. I've been unemployed for a little while. And I'm just like not going to come back at all to work. There's also this literature on duration dependence or the unemployment scar, which is the idea that if people who have been unemployed for a while, they have a harder time then getting reemployed. And there's a lot of different reasons why that could be. Maybe employers are interpreting something about their quality or there's some skill depreciation. And habit formation kind of offers this alternate conception of what skill depreciation might be. If you've been unemployed for a while, you might actually just not want to be employed again. Or employers might view you as not as good at being productive or exhibiting or, supplying labor. Now, that's kind of very general for labor and macro, but we think in addition to that, habit formation might have especially important implications for low-income settings. So if you think about developing country settings and also low-income workers in rich countries, they tend to have much more frequent shocks to their labor supply. So they, face unpredictable shift schedules. People who work in informal or casual work, might have work some days and not others. In developing countries, there's massive seasonality where there's periods of peak labor demand and lean periods where people don't work very much, where there's 50% unemployment in the lean periods, but 90% employment in the peak periods. And then there's lots of idiosyncratic shocks, like, people have to stay home from work because of their own illness, or someone in their family gets sick, or there's network obligations that kind of require it. And so these external constraints in developing country settings make it difficult to regularly supply labor. But if there's habit formation, there's an additional implication of this volatility, which is that if it might endogenously impact your underlying preferences for regular labor supply. If you're not used to regularly supplying labor, it might not be interesting or attractive to you to regularly supply labor. And that has then implications for thinking about why people might not want formal jobs in developing countries and so on. So what we're going to do in this paper is we're going to test for habit formation and labor supply, but we're also going to look very specifically at the mediating role of shocks. So we're going to do a randomized trial with 200 casual laborers who work across 11 different labor stands in a large Indian city. And the intervention is quite simple. We're going to give people an incentive to arrive to the stand by 8 a.m. for 7 weeks. And then, and when we do that, so that's our first stage, our incentives are effective. We increase labor supply by 26%. But then the key test for habit formation is what happens after we remove the incentives. And what we see is that after we take those incentives away, the treatment group is persistently have higher attendance for 2 months relative to the control group. And so we see an 18% increase in stand attendance. And that leads to a 10% increase in overall employment levels from any source for the treatment group. And we also see signs of a change in preferences. So for example, as a result, in this post period after the incentives are removed, we see that treated workers have an increased preference for taking on contracts with a longer duration or contracts that are less flexible. But importantly, what we see is that if you are hit with a negative shock that pulls you out of the labor market for a week during this post period, treatment effects collapse to zero. Treatment and control workers go back to looking exactly the same. So this new habit that you've formed kind of collapses and you go right back to your old equilibrium. And then we investigate a bunch of potential confounds, and we don't find evidence for things like, really, this is a learning story where workers have learned something about the job finding probability, or like employer demand is driving changes, or there's habit formation consumption, or people have just like paid some fixed cost to adjust their time use, or that sort of thing. So I'll walk you through that. And then finally, we look on the employer side and we show that employers predict the persistence of labor supply, and they actually prefer treated workers, are willing to pay to hire workers that were treated with this like higher habit stock, which then feeds back into this discussion of, what might be causing the unemployment scar or duration dependence. Okay, so this contributes to two sets of literatures. There's like a burgeoning literature in psychology and economics on habit formation. And the empirical tests, at least in the economics literature, have kind of used this design approach that we build on, of like, if you incentivize somebody to like go to the gym or wash their hands or take a short shower, and then you take that incentive away, we do see short-term persistence, but then it kind of declines. And so what we're doing is we're adding to this by looking at habit formation in this very core economic behavior of labor supply. And we can kind of do maybe a more detailed job in looking at like the mechanisms that are driving that. Is it something like you just paid a fixed cost to change something, or is it or is it a peer effect, or is it actually like an underlying change in preferences? And then really importantly, we can help explain what this decline is, where is it coming from, by looking at the mediating role of shocks. This also contributes to the literature on labor theories, where the move to full-time formal jobs is considered core for structural transformation to happen. But if you look in developing countries, a lot of workers have a preference to not want formal jobs. We see high absenteeism, we see irregular supply. And this habituation to regular, and we're showing this habituation of regular labor supply actually can change people's preferences around these things. And so it could be that the features of underdevelopment itself, these external constraints, these shocks, this irregularity that goes hand in hand with underdevelopment, might actually inhibit the habit formation that prompts workers to want to have regular jobs. And this kind of accords with the way people have thought about the transition during the Industrial Revolution, of what kind of enabled the transition from irregular work to regular formal factory work. And we're kind of like, putting that idea that's existed for a long time within the lens of habit formation. Okay, so where do we do this? We're going to do this in urban spot markets in Chennai. So these are just public spaces where people gather to search for employment, and people get there in the morning. Employers come by with trucks, put them on a truck, and take them to go to work. Employers hire for short spells. So the modal contract is 1 day. A contract's almost always less than a week. And these are, really common in developing countries. It's how hundreds of millions of workers get work every single day. And so we're going to do this in Chennai, India. And in this setting, here I'm just showing how many days a week at baseline people are attending the labor stand. And you can see that it's all over the place, from 0 to 6. 59% of days is the average attendance, 59% of people come less than 4 days a week, and 78% come less than 5 days a week. And so if you ask workers, they want to come 5 days a week, at least 5 to 6 days a week, but actually they only come about 4 days a week on average. And so there's a return in this setting to not just coming to the labor stand, but coming by 8 a.m. So this is the probability of finding a job, just in the observational data, based on when people have arrived. And so you can sort of see there's a drop off in the probability of finding a job if you come after 8, because more employers tend to come between 6 and 8 to pick people up. And so if you attend by 8 a.m., you can get a job 70 to 80% of days, but it drops off after that. And at baseline, people have a quite accurate belief about this relationship. They understand kind of this pattern is there. So one other thing about this context is this thing I alluded to, that people actually have a strong desire for flexibility. So if we ask these workers, if you were offered a long-run job today, how likely are you to take it? And only 33% say likely or very likely. And this matches other things in development literature. We think a factory job is this like, path to stability. It often gives you more earnings, but people actually are like, no, thanks, I don't want that kind of job. And if you ask them why, 33% say, I don't want a fixed schedule, I prefer flexibility, and 32% say I have more free time with casual work. And so there does seem to be this preference for flexibility that's like relevant here. Okay, so let me pause there for a second. Are there any clarifying questions or any questions before I move to the design?
So far, you have been extremely clear. There's a question in the Q&A, but I think that will be better answered actually later on. So
Okay,
You
okay.
can go ahead, actually.
Okay, great. I'll stop again after the design in case there's other questions. So we're going to conduct our experiment in 11 labor stands, which, and you can think of each labor stand as like its own local labor market that are going to be rolled out in a staggered way over the course of the year. And so we have 225 workers who are all men aged 18 to 55, and predominantly it's because it's men who come to these labor stands to work. We select workers on low baseline attendance, so people who have come to the stand 4 days or less per week, because then obviously those are the ones that have room to move up. And the average worker in our sample has been at the labor stand for over 10 years. So these are people who are highly experienced. Like this is their full-time job. They come to the labor stand, they get work, and that's how they like make their money. And almost all the workers go to only one labor stand. So if you want to actively search for work, like, you go there. And typically all of these jobs are in construction, it just so happens. And so in this setting, the primary means of active job search is attendance at the stand. You show up, if you want to find a job and you actively want to engage in search, you show up to the stand in the morning. And so this labor stand setting has this really nice measurement advantage where we can say like there's a clear revealed preference measure of labor supply, which is showing up to the stand. So we don't have to ask people to measure labor supply, did you want work today, but maybe you couldn't find it, which is how you usually have to do it in economics applications. We can just distinguish it through this revealed preference measure from voluntary unemployment. And it's also directly observable, so we can just measure it. We don't need to rely on survey self-reports. So we have survey staff at every labor stand who just get there by 6 a.m. and they just like look to see who's shown up that day. And that gives us like a complete measure of attendance at the stand for each person. And then we complement that, of course, with like surveys and stuff on employment and so on. So here's the structure of the experiment. We have a baseline period where we kind of like, look at people, we screen on baseline attendance and so on. And then phase one, which is like the treatment period, is 7 weeks long. So the treatment group gets a fixed incentive payment, which corresponds to about 12% of their average daily earnings for each day the worker arrives by 8 a.m. And the control group in expectation gets a similar amount of money. So what we do to the control group is that each control worker is randomly matched each week with one treatment worker. And the control worker just earns whatever the treatment worker earned in incentives that week. And that's unconditional. So whether the control worker shows up or not, how many days they show up, what time they arrive, it doesn't matter. They're going to get the amount of earnings that a matched treatment worker got, which allows us to hold income effects the same on average. And so what we do is this is individual level randomization within the stand, stratified by baseline attendance and wages. We directly observe attendance and when people arrive, right, through our own surveyors. And then we use surveys, high frequency surveys, to get at what you were doing if you didn't come and whether you worked or not. And then we treat a very a small fraction of the stand to avoid GE effects. And the payments are made at cash at the end of the week for everybody. So then the important phase is phase two. So then we take the incentives away and then we just watch what happens. And we track impacts over 2 months because we didn't really think effects would last longer than 2 months. So we kind of do this every day. We still have our people going to the stand to measure attendance, and we continue to do surveys to measure employment and so on. And then we have a follow-up period that's longer for 3 months where we just show up to the stand 1 to 2 times a week just to like look at attendance and we don't conduct surveys. So let me stop there. Any questions about the design?
Again, it seems that everything is super clear.
Okay, thank
So
you.
I'll let you go ahead.
Okay, awesome, great. So what do we find? So these are the results for the first stage where we just actually are incentivizing people to show up. So here we should obviously expect to see effects. So these are CDFs of attendance at the stand. So what fraction of people come on a given day a week from 0 to 6. So the right is the red is the treatment group and the gray is the control group. And what you basically see is this rightward shift, right? So we do increase the likelihood that people are coming to the stand at all on a given day. The treatment group is coming more than the control group. And then this is the distribution of arrival times. And what you can sort of see is there's this big bunching of the mass for the treatment group just before 8 a.m. So we are, the incentives are working and getting people to show up more often. And when they do show up, they're much more likely to arrive by 8 a.m. So then what happens after the incentives are removed? So we continue to see this rightward shift in attendance by the treatment group. So even after now, there's no more incentives to show up. Like nobody's getting paid any money. We're just like sitting back and watching what happens. The treatment group is still showing up more often than the control group. And if you look at arrival times, we still see earlier arrival times for the treatment group than the control group. So we put that in regression format. These are the treatment effects for phase 1. So this is just an intent to treat regression, simple treatment versus control difference. So phase 1 is the first stage. And what we basically see is that our intervention basically doubles the rate of people arriving by 8 a.m. And we have a 26% treatment effect on overall attendance, like the probability of attending the stand. And then in phase 2, we have a 37% impact on attending by 8 a.m. Over like this 2-month period after the incentives are removed, and an 18% treatment effect on overall attendance. And then this translates to a 10% increase in the total employment rate. And this is like total employment, whether you found it at the stand or if you found it like some other way, or you work somewhere else. This is like anything that you did that like for money. And then this is just kind of showing what things look like over time. So this is kind of baseline. These are the phase 1 effects. And then this is kind of phase 2 effects. And then you kind of see that, by the 5-month follow-up period, maybe there's a difference in these lines, but this difference is no longer significant. So by the end, you basically get convergence. And this is really similar to what other people have found. They tend to find, when they've looked at hand washing or going to the gym, you tend to find convergence kind of by this point. So we have maybe we have a longer period maybe before convergence happens. And we have, but it's kind of these patterns you sort of see time and time again. So then let's think about deterioration of effects over time. So here, what I'm doing is just plotting treatment times, just a linear control for what week you are. So this is in phase 2. So this is after the incentives have been removed. So we see an initial treatment effect, and then we kind of see this deterioration of effects over time. And then this is a dummy for being in the 2nd month of phase 2. And again, we sort of see this deterioration of effects over time, that if in the 1st month of phase 1, this is the effect. In the 2nd month of phase 1, this is the effect is about half. So we see this evidence of decay over phase 1. And this is, by the way, these are standard errors. These are p-values in brackets. So how should we think about where this is coming from? It's not obvious you should be getting this sort of decay. So if you think of, for example, a Becker addiction model or so on, where your labor supply today is a function of your labor supply in the past. Well, you've been supplying labor in the past kind of very steadily. Even in phase 2, it's higher. So how should we understand where this decay is coming from? So I want to go back to this idea of shocks. So as I said, in this setting, workers frequently face tons of disruptions to their labor supply. You might have a festival on a Tuesday, you might have a wedding on a Thursday, your relatives might show up to visit you in the middle of the week, and social kind of norms require that you're going to not go to your casual job, but instead like take them around, because if you don't, then they won't do that for you when you go there, or people won't attend your wedding if you don't go to their wedding. And so there's a lot of these shocks. Now, of course, these self-reported shocks might be endogenous, so we can't use those. And so what we're going to do is create a data-driven proxy for labor supply disruption by just looking at the residualized attendance of other workers. So we're just going to use like a leave one out mean and just say, what happens to the attendance of other people at your labor stand? And that's a way to get a proxy for festivals, like religious festivals, holidays, rain, like just things that are kind of aggregate shocks to whether you're going to be at the labor stand or not. And so what we're going to do is define a shock where the attendance of the other people in your labor stand is below the 25th percentile. And this is of the overall distribution. And this is robust to alternate cutoffs. It doesn't really change very much if you go to 20th or 30th percentile. And if we do this, what we see is we have a lot of variation in shocks. So in, some stands are getting shocks in week 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or so on. And then there's like 3 stands that don't get any shock at all during the course of this, the experiment. And remember, we've like rolled it out over the course of the year in a staggered way. So some labor stands are kind of in the early couple months, some labor stands are later. And so kind of there's like this staggering over time, which is partly what's giving us this like variation. So, what we want to do is to say what happens to the treatment effects we observe in phase 2 after a shock temporarily pulls workers out of the labor market. Okay, so before I go on, I just want to make sure, I just want to ask if there's any questions.
So Supreet, there's a question by Alessandro Tarozzi who's asking about, can you exclude that the treated expected something, some reward at some point, despite the fact that we're told that that wasn't gonna come. So
Yeah, I mean, I mean, no, we were pretty clear. I think we also did a comprehension quiz, but I think that this next set of results will also help with that, because I think if that was like something, then I don't think you should necessarily expect this these shocks to kind of like make treatment effects collapse to zero. So I think that's going to be something that also helps us beyond kind of our feeling that people understood to do this. Now, one other thing I will say is that if you you know, one thing that did happen is people, you know, it was 7 weeks, it was quite a while that we did the first intervention or the phase one, and literally every Saturday you would be getting paid this money, like every Saturday, week after week after week for 7 weeks, and then it just like stops, right? It just stops. And like in week one, maybe people might have been confused. In week two, maybe people were confused. But week three, it still hasn't been, no money has come, right? Nobody's getting paid any incentive payments among treatment and control workers. So it's not clear why you should still see effects. Like even 4 weeks in, we see a big effect, right? If you like go back to this figure, it's really not until towards the end of phase two that we really see the effects like kind of converging. And so I think it's harder to understand why like week 4 or 5 we would still have this big gap, because, you know, people should have gotten that, oh, there's like no money coming in. It's been over a month. Okay. Any other questions?
yeah, I have a question. It's just clarification for you. So when you actually residualize the shock in this case, so you're sort of capturing some common component within the stand, right? So
Yeah.
somewhat it has to be either that they are going to the same festivities, or that they're part of the same group of people who tend to make decisions somewhat together. Do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think that we unfortunately don't have a sense. I don't think it's the case that they're all a part of like the same very tight-knit social network, because it is such a big urban city and people are kind of commuting from like a, you know, a radius around the labor stand, and the people who live over here are going to be like not necessarily socially connected to the people who live over here, given it's such a massive city of like, you know, how many millions and millions of people. But I think so the way I would think about what aggregate shocks this is picking up is going to be twofold. It's going to be things like religious festivals and holidays, which are just much more aggregate. And then it's really coming off the time variation that we have. And if you, when we look at what these shocks are picking up, we do see that, right? So you see like Diwali in there, you see Dussehra in there, you see these like religious festivals in there. The other thing it's likely picking up are things like it rained, and so like nobody came to the stand. Right. So if it like rained for a week, then like, and people just didn't come very much, like that would be in here too. So I think it's most likely a combination of those things, though for some of the stands, it could be that if enough people are going to the same wedding or same event, you wouldn't see this, but we don't have great data to capture that.
And you don't think there's anything to do with the expectation about labor demand that is specific to a specific stand? I mean, sort of, I know there is going to be work in that particular place because I've been told or whatever, you know, we see that there's work, construction or whatever is
Yeah.
happening like close by. Uh,
Right. Yeah, I think that is possible. Like it could just be that if there's like something else going on, you might do it. Now I think that these are, I mean, if you think about it, this is where people, like 98% of people go to one labor stand. They've been going for 10 years. It's Chennai, it's like this massive city. I don't think it's like, unless it's for something like rain, I don't think that there's going to be like, oh, this week there's like nobody hiring anymore. Like you know, I mean, if you just think about kind of the way these stands work, I think it's generally that there is kind of this like steady stream of employers, and day to day, of course, there's fluctuations. But even if it is the case that, you know, I don't go because I anticipate low labor demand, I think that's okay. I think what we're trying to capture is just the fact that you fall out of the habit of like going every day. And whatever is creating that, I think is okay for us. The only way in which this is going to have issues for us, and then this is why I think your question is important, is if what's happening is you if there's like serial correlation. So now the labor demand has fallen, but it's not just now, it's like now going to be fallen for like the rest of the, you know, 2 months. And as a result, like nobody's coming to work anymore, both treatment and control. And so, you know, and that's why treatment flux collapse to zero. So that's kind of thing. But I think in this setting, that's just not right. You saw control group line. It's like pretty stable, right? So it's not like everybody's just gone down to zero. It's just that the treatment group converges back to where the control group is. Whereas if what was happening is that like if nobody's hiring, the control group should also go down and stay down, but they only go down for that 1 week and then they kind of go back to where they were before.
There's also an extra question that just popped up. So Peter is asking, the figure that you displayed with the effects over time, so the averages over time across groups, why does the control group move that much? I guess it's because there's volatility, but I'll let you answer that.
Yeah, I think this is just sampling variation from having, our sample. Like there's seasonality, there's just like other things going on here. And so I think we're kind of just plotting the raw data, and it is just moving up and down. Some of these are like lots of people go home to their village probably right here because maybe there's some festival and so on.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so what do we find? So what we're gonna do is now we're gonna look at what happens to effects after a shock temporarily pulls workers out of the labor market. And so these are now difference in differences regressions. And what this is the treatment effect. And again, this is phase 2, so this is after the incentives have been removed, it's like post-period. So this is the treatment effect on, there's a difference between treatment and control workers in the absence of a shock. So no shock has happened to your stand to like pull people out of the labor market. And so we sort of see this like persistence. Now, if you look at what happens after a shock pulls workers out of the labor market for a week, and now like everyone's back, treatment effects collapse to zero, right? If you add these two things up, they're like bang on zero. And so the treatment effects just completely disappear after the shock disrupts stand attendance. And these are OLS standard errors. And then in brackets, we're actually showing you wild bootstrap standard errors, like to reflect clustering at the stand level, since the shocks are at the stand level. So, and so then we can add kind of just a linear time trend now with just the week number. And before, remember, that had showed this like linear decline over time, but now we no longer see any discernible decline in effects over time outside of shocks. So it's like the shocks are causing treatment effects to collapse to zero, but outside of that, we don't have evidence, it's like clear evidence anymore that there's like a decline over time. Of course, the standard error is big, but it's just a lot of that decline is actually just being absorbed by the shocks. Then what we can do is to say, well, is this, what happens? What I'm doing here is I'm just breaking up the post period, like after the shock, and literally the week after the shock, like the shock is over now, the shock is done, the volley's over, people are back to work. What is the interaction? And then this is like two plus weeks after the shock. And what you basically see is that while this interaction term is a bit noisier, especially with, because it's a smaller amount of data, what you basically see is that even like literally the week after shock, we can't reject that everyone's back to their old equilibrium. The treatment effects have collapsed to zero, and then of course they stay zero in the following weeks. And that's true, in both kinds of specifications, whether we control for this or not. So it seems like people are immediately jumping back to their old equilibrium. This is not a gradual decline. And this again is at odds with, this is starting to provide us also some insight into how to conceptualize what habit formation is psychologically. This is not consistent with the way we often model state dependence, like through like the Becker addiction model, where basically it's where that would create a much more gradual decline over time. Okay, so now let me like go through some potential confounds. I can stop again if there's any questions. Yeah, thoughts.
So does that suggest that it's the opposite, so that it's like sleeping late is the habit formation? And you treat them, you help them, like, okay, not eat sugar, not take the drug, whatever. Yeah. And then as soon as you do it once, you're back on the wagon. Like,
yeah, I think that could be what's happening. Like, I think it's not, we can't, like, I think we don't have, like, I'm going to show you data on things like time use and other stuff that's going to help with some kind of mechanisms, but I think that we're not going to be able to unpack too well. Like, I think this kind of a field experiment is probably not well suited to thinking about like, what is it that's like changing, that's like causing you. But I think what we are doing, which is sort of, I think, new, is just like showing this immediate collapse. It's not a gradual decline. It is this immediate collapse. And then that clearly raises the question you're asking, which is like, what is that collapse? Like, what is it that you just fall right back out of your habit? And I think people do anecdotally talk about this, right? When you're on a diet, and you've been really disciplined, and then it's like Thanksgiving comes and you've like binged for 3 days on like, you know, or Christmas comes and you've like had all these festivities with your family or whatever. And then like you go back and you've kind of fallen off the wagon, right? There's this like phrase in English, like falling off the wagon, which implies this kind of like collapse. Like you've fallen off the wagon, now you've done, like you don't no longer have that virtuous habit. And so I think it's like we push these people into kind of a new virtuous, from their own perspective, virtuous equilibrium, because they say they wanted to work more than they were, but then they kind of like fell off the wagon with this temporary disruption. Okay. All right, so now let me go through some confounds. Could other things be explaining this pattern of results? So we're gonna look at so I'm gonna first start with this idea of perceived changes in the job finding probability. So this could be, you know, a couple of things. So for example, you might say, well, maybe what you've done in phase 1 is gotten workers to learn about the stand. They've like come every day, and now they've like increased their beliefs about the job finding probability. My co-author Heather is here, who can also help answer questions. Hi, Heather. Hi. So it might be that workers increase their beliefs about the job finding probability, right? And so now they realize, oh, if I arrive by 8, I'm going to be more likely to get a job. I've like learned something. It could also be that because these treatment workers are coming more often in phase 1, maybe employers have learned who are the good workers, and they're like, oh, this guy's like really regular, I'm going to like hire him more often. And so that means that workers then perceive a higher return to stand attendance. I'm more likely to get a job now if I come, and so I'm going to keep coming in phase 2 because now employers know me. So both of these explanations imply that treated workers should perceive a higher job finding probability, right? Both of them operate through that belief about the job finding probability being higher for treatment workers and control workers. So we can look directly at that. And so we ask workers in phase 2, how many days of work would you find if you came to the labor stand every day at 8 a.m.? Like, you know, so if you came every day at 8 a.m., what would you find? And remember, I said that at baseline, people have very accurate beliefs about this. So if you ask workers, their mean belief at baseline is 76%. When we ask them at baseline, in the data at 77%. They're like incredibly accurate, and that makes sense because they have more than 10 years of experience. These guys are not like inexperienced new people. They know what the job finding probability is. But then we again ask this question again in phase 2 to see, has there been a change in this belief? And the treatment effect is essentially 0. It's less than 1%. And it's, you know, insignificant. Of course, the standard errors are big, but we just don't see any evidence that people have like changed their belief about the job finding probability. And if you think about the magnitude of our effect, like the phase 2 effect is like an 18% increase in attendance. Like you would need to have a real, like a substantive change in your belief about finding a job in the future for that. In addition, we don't see any discernible effect on the average wage if you think like wages might reflect quality, though in this setting, given wage compression and the fact that there's like prevailing daily wages, I don't know if they would, but we don't see that. And this kind of explanation can't explain why effects would immediately disappear after a week of disruption. If employers are like, oh, this is now a really talented guy, I should hire him more often, just because everybody went away for Diwali for a week and came back, why would then they no longer believe that about that person? So we don't really see evidence for those explanations. The other possibility that one might worry about is that is this really displacement of control workers or some sort of general equilibrium effect? And you know, as I said, we only treat 4 to 10% of the labor stand in order to minimize this sort of displacement effect. So there's like a labor stand with like 200 people. And like some, you know, a small set of workers are like, you know, 10 workers are coming, you know, 0.5 days more a week or something. It's not clear that an employer is going to notice this. It's not clear that workers are necessarily going to notice that. And so consistent with that, we don't see heterogeneity by fraction treated. We don't see an impact on the perceived job finding rate. Because again, if this was displacement or something like that, treated workers should be more likely to think I'm going to get a job than control workers. We also don't see differential exit of control workers from the labor stand where they're like leaving to go look for a job somewhere else. And again, this is inconsistent with the SHOX results. Now, another possibility is that there is habit formation going on, but it's habit formation and consumption. So in phase 1, the treatment group got used to like, you know, the treatment group got used to like earning more money. Even though, and so then they want to kind of keep working to maintain that lifestyle because they're used to working to earn that money. Now the control group got a similar amount of cash, so it's not clear why you should have a difference in habit formation and consumption. But regardless, even on top of that, we can exploit random variation in payments to the control group that happened in phase 1, right? Because some control workers get paid more or less based on which treatment worker they were randomly matched with. And so that is actually clean variation we can use. And we don't see that people who got higher payments in phase 1 have higher phase 2 attendance. So it doesn't seem like, at least in this setting, habit formation and consumption is going on. And this habit formation consumption is a key idea in macro for why you might get hysteresis in the labor market. So we seem to see it on the labor supply side rather than the consumption side, at least in our very particular setting. Okay, so let me stop there. Are there any questions about the confounds?
No, it seems like
Okay, great.
it's clear.
I convinced you. Okay, so then what is changing under the hood? So let me get to mechanisms. So we're gonna now do some ancillary tests. These are all gonna be in phase 2. So not all in phase 1, only in phase 2 after the incentives are removed. And to try to get a sense. And one thing I should note is that a lot of this data we did not do in the earliest stands. We kind of, once we got our feet under us, we added this in the later stands. So we're not gonna have the full sample. But we have treatment effects for the stands where we did do this, if you just also look at average treatment effects. Because the first is time use. Are people just rearranging their activities at home? So did people just pay a fixed cost of like who drops the kids off at work or at school or that sort of thing? And now that I've paid that fixed cost in phase 1, I continue in phase 2. And so we basically do time use surveys where we ask people like, what are you doing in the morning? And we don't really see evidence of like people shifting activities to other people in the household or changing kind of very strongly this. So we don't really see evidence of this sort of fixed cost thing. We also ask people, how strongly do you agree with the following statement? I need to rearrange my morning activities on the days that I have to go to the stand. And if the treatment group just kind of has now arranged their life where like the default is going to the stand because they never have to get water in the morning or something anymore, then you might see a treatment effect on this question, but we actually see no effect. We don't see, on a 5-point scale, the coefficient is 0.03. So we just don't see that people are reporting somehow there's like a different organization to their morning that basically has become more of a default activity because of that. Instead, what we sort of see is not a default in your physical time use, but perhaps a psychological default. So in the psychology literature, there's a view that one of the things that creates habits is this idea of automaticity. It's just the default. I just know that on the days I have the development seminar, I go into my office. So when I think about on Monday, am I going into work? I just know that I'm going into work every Monday. It's not an active choice because I've just gotten used to the fact that every Monday I go into work. So we ask people, how strongly do you agree with the following statement? Going to the stand is something I do without thinking. And again, it's a 5-point Likert scale. And we have some variation in when in phase 2 we ask this question. For some workers, we ask them earlier in phase 2, and some workers we ask them afterwards in phase 2. And so what we find is if you just look on average, the treatment group is more likely, about 10% more, or if you look at relative to the mean, they're more likely to agree in phase 2 that going to the labor stand is something I do without thinking. They also, it also then, but if we asked you after your labor stand had a shock, the treatment effect disappears, it collapses to 0. Kind of consistent with this idea, the shock has removed that psychological default to Gaurang's earlier question. Now, does this actually lead to a change, going back to this motivation around, this move to formal work and the fact that developing country workers don't want formal work? They all are just used to doing casual work and they want to stick to doing casual work. Do we see that this increased automaticity has actually lead to a change in how much you value flexibility? So we do a couple of things. We ask workers, this is a hypothetical question, what if you were offered a 6-day job contract, but where you had a wage penalty if you missed some days? So it's kind of like what a real job is, right? Like you kind of have to come every day for 6 days. And if you absent, you'll lose some of your earnings. Treated workers are like substantially more likely to say, yes, that kind of job appeals to me. Again, this is in phase 2. They're like more than double the rate of the control workers. This kind of like saying I would take a longer run contract, not just a 1-day one, but a 6-day one where I really have to come all 6 days to get my wages. We also do a revealed preference exercise where we offer workers the choice between, 80 rupees if you come next week for on any 2 days, you get to pick the days, versus 90 rupees if you come on 2 specific days that we're going to say for you. We also give them, you can have, 70 rupees for sure, or 90 rupees if you come on 2 inflexible days next week. And so we're going to pool these 2, and we find again is a pretty sizable effect on whether treated workers find, like picking the inflexible work option than the treated workers. And again, we have some suggestive evidence that if we happen to ask you that after a shock had hit you, it's much noisier, but we sort of can't reject it. We can't say anymore, or we can't reject that there's no difference between treatment and control after shocks. Okay, so I know I need to wrap up soon, and I'll skip over some of this stuff, but I want to just pause here and just ask if there's any questions.
I think you should go ahead, Supreet. We'll have like 10, 15 minutes afterwards where the question can be asked. So just
that's great. Okay, all right. So I'll wrap this up in the next few minutes. So do employers perceive the presence of habit formation? So I'm going to just first go through just the fact that, just to give you a sense of how big this problem is. So we survey 167 employers who frequent labor stands. And if you ask them, like, if you were to give workers a 10-day contract, what fraction of days would the average worker miss? And they think it's like 20 to 30%. Like, they just really, like, people are, absenteeism is a huge problem. Like 20 to 30% of people wouldn't come if I offered a 10-day job. And in fact, in anticipation of this, when they do have multi-day jobs, they hire 30% more workers, anticipating that not everybody's going to come. So you can just imagine how just the cost to employers, where they just anticipate this absenteeism, this lack of regularity, and then they like overfill the jobs, like in order to ensure enough people come to work. They say that this absenteeism is really costly. If you ask them how much time does it typically take to find a worker to replace someone who was supposed to come to work but didn't, you can just sort of see that for skilled workers especially, it's like quite high. You know, for some it's above 90 minutes. Then you have to like retrain people, because if it's a new person rather than the person you hired for a multi-day job. And now, importantly, kind of the two things I want to show you is that employers have startlingly accurate beliefs about habit formation. So we did is, with a different set of 115 employers, we explain the design of our intervention. We tell them what the magnitude of impacts was in phase 1. And then we just sort of say, you know, out of every 100 control participants, you know, how many like what were the treatment effects in phase 1? And then we ask them, out of 100, every 100 participants, how many do you think were still coming in control? Like, we told them for the control group, how many come 2 weeks after, 4 weeks after, 4 months after. So that's kind of what we show them. We basically say, you know, how many control workers actually came 2 months later, and so on. And then we ask them to their beliefs about what they thought the treatment effects would be. So in a frequentist way that's easy for them to do. And basically, this is the actual attendance of treatment workers. This is their prediction, the employer's prediction. And you can see they're like bang on. If anything, by the end, if you ask them for persistence 4 months later, they overestimate. So basically, the employers really believe, and this is like incentivized, right? They get paid for accuracy. They really believe that the habit formation is a thing, that if you got people to show up more often and you took the incentives away, they would continue to show up more often. And if anything, they overestimate the persistence of it over time. And not only that, they're actually willing to then pay for workers with a habit stock. So we do, with a third set of employers, we explain the results of our training intervention, where we got people to show up more. And then we offer them a chance to enter a lottery for a voucher where they get a subsidy to hire one of the workers from the experiment. If they hire that worker, they get a subsidy. And you only get the subsidy if the worker is at the labor stand on the day that you're hiring. So for next Wednesday, if you can pick a treatment worker or control worker, and the treatment worker costs you more. And what we find is 80% of employers are willing to pay more, 11 to 22% more of the daily wage bill for a chance at hiring a worker with habit stock, which kind of which, because you only get this money if the worker actually showed up, is reflecting some combination of this belief that the worker is going to be more likely to be there, so actually get the subsidy, and maybe productivity that we can't distinguish. Okay, so and so what are the potential implications for labor market structure? If you then ask employers, you know, what if such regular workers existed where you could just count on people to show up more often, more regularly? Would this change anything about how you offer work? And you basically see that employers would say, you know, I would actually provide more training to workers. I would actually change the kind, some even say I would change the kind of business I would run. I would expand my business. And in general, they say I'd be more willing to, you know, offer longer run contracts. And so what this suggests, and kind of the thing I want to end on, is that we think that as countries develop, there's this transition from casual work to formal work. And of course, there's important demand side reasons why that might not happen. But what this is suggesting is that there's also a supply side reason. If you have a regular formal job, but people don't show up, that's incredibly costly. So in some sense, this labor market has endogenously responded by, rather than having long run jobs where you can train somebody once and then they show up for 2 weeks or for a month or 2 months, every day these guys are coming and taking new workers. And so this lack of formality could also be an endogenous response to this labor supply behavior. Okay, so in our experiment, we created these temporary incentives, which led to this persistent 18% increase in labor supply 2 months later. Hysteresis in labor supply is like driven by state dependence. This increase is consequential because of the impact on overall employment rates. We see suggestive evidence for a change in the psychological default and people having an increased willingness to take up less flexible work contracts, which implies some change in preferences. But very importantly, you get people to this higher equilibrium. So after the peak season, people have worked really hard. They've been used to working every day. But then there's a shock that makes them revert back to their old equilibrium, like the lean season or our setting, like temporary shocks. Employers anticipate habit formation and decay, which kind of gives a new light to what skill depreciation might mean in the duration dependence literature. And this has this potential relevance for understanding why is spot contracting so prevalent in developing countries. What are the barriers to structural transformation? Grants, you have your hand up.
Yes, I was wondering why employers do not partially incentivize at least attendance. So I could give you a lower salary on the first day, higher salary on the second day, etc., etc. Like, you know, I understand you want to be paid for each day, but like if the worker kind of want to be incentivized too, he knows there's a job. Like, why do they give a flat wage?
Yeah, so I think that you know, it's like any amenity. If flexibility is an amenity that workers value, whether that amenity is provided or not in the labor market, it's going to depend on the utility for workers, like how much you have to pay workers and to take the disamenity of the lack of flexibility. And so I think what we're just seeing is that, you know, when you look at when we ask people just their willingness to pay, they might say like, I would pay a 10% wage premium to get somebody who would come every day. But I think you would have to pay these workers more than 10% on average to get them to come every day for like a week.
But I totally understand if there was not the part where the workers would like themselves to actually work more. You see what I mean? That it was purely, okay, they like to decide, today I don't feel like waking up, this, that, and then I would need to compensate. But if you're telling me the full thing was that the worker themselves would like to actually work more than what, then there should be some scope for some win-win.
Yeah, but if you think about what it took for us to do it, we gave them 12% of their daily wage for 7 weeks, right? I mean, I think it's just the magnitude of the problem. Whereas if you're in the equilibrium where they are now like, you know, supplying high effort, then the cost would be less because it's less of a disamenity. So I think it's still that same thing applies. They want to, but it takes so much money to get them. And it's not something that's persistent because then they are going to get hit with a shock and then you're back to zero. And so I think for a particular employer to do it in a setting where there are other reasons for low attachment, you know, then like I think employers would just say it just would cost me too much is my sense.
Okay.
I think there's a question from the floor. Balasai, you should be able to open up your mic.
Thank you. Thank you, Supreet, for the presentation. I was wondering in the mechanisms when people falling out of the habit after shocks, especially when you're thinking about the correlated shocks for the stand, like how, like have you asked any questions about group commitment, and especially when people have common shocks and they fall out of the habit? Like, for example, the shocks could be like today, like maybe my friend who I used to go to the stand with hasn't come after Diwali, like probably for the couple of days, and like some kind of like these kind of shock, these kind of like group commitments falling out after shock, like so. Like, do you see like these are relevant like in this context, like other than the individual psychological or the fixed cost that you explored?
So your idea is maybe what's happening is that they have like a group commitment to come together and then somehow that erodes during the shock and then they don't recapture it. Is that the idea?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, so we don't have data on that specifically. I think the reason that's unlikely is just because if you think about it, these guys have been coming to the same labor stand together for 10 years. And so, I think that because we randomize within a labor stand, it's just as likely you would have a control worker who's your friend that you have this group commitment with than as a treatment worker, if that's kind of your natural state where you guys commute together or come together. So to me, it seems less likely that that would be the case. But, we don't have direct evidence on that, but I think it would be this kind of, like what you're trying to say could there be some like social reason why a shock disrupts something? And I think it's, unlikely that that could kind of explain the pattern within stand. What we do have, which we haven't looked at, is we do have peer effects data. Like we have network data on who are your friends. And so I think we can look at things like if a larger fraction of people who are your friends were in the treatment group, like does that do something different? So I think that's something we can look at to get more insight into this.
Thank you.
Thank you for the idea. Yeah, thank you for the idea. Yeah, Nico?
Yeah, so I'm wondering how, like the word habit formation, is this really habit formation or some other behavioral change you're documenting? Because for me, it's hard to believe that a habit is so easy to break, right? Like you think, for example, someone who, runs every week, right? Maybe they get a shock and they don't run anymore, but then after the shock is gone, then you should bounce back to your right?
Yeah.
To your level. So it's and also the fact that it's so easy. Well, maybe not easy, but you form this habit that's that it's hard to form it, but it goes away too easily, right? And to me, a habit and a little bit of literature I've read on these things is it's harder to break a habit. And I'm wondering if is this really a change in preferences, or maybe just for some reason the change, for example, in the cost of providing effort, right? For some reason that cost of effort provision is changing with your treatment, and then that goes away with the shock.
Yeah, I mean, I think a different way to think about it is the stable long run habit is not coming to the labor stand very much. It's coming less than 4 days a week, right? And what we've done is we bump them out of that. Like, what is the habit? Is the habit that they've had their entire lives. Like, I think that's the intuition now. I'm used to running every day, but if I've been running every day for my entire life, for them, the equivalent of that is coming not very much every week, right? And then what we've done is had a very transitory change in that. 40 years of your life and coming not very frequently, and then like 7 weeks of coming frequently. So I think the way I think about it is that this new steady state is a fragile one. And that can help us understand why we also see that in so many other settings, right? As I mentioned, when incentivize people to study for midterms, or go to the gym or wash their hands, you again see this decay over time, right? So you can change it in the short run, but then it kind of decays. And presumably, though we don't test this, but Lorenz Goethe has a really nice paper where he does test this in the context of taking shorter showers to save water for environmental conservation. If you treat people like to get them to incentivize your behavior for a little bit of time, you get a little bit of persistence before it decays. If you do it for a longer time, you get longer persistence before it decays. So I think this is telling us something about like the stickiness of the new equilibrium. And I don't know about you, but in my own life, I have this. So for example, when the summer begins, I'm coming off of the spring semester, I'm used to going to the office like all the time. In the beginning of the summer, I still go into the office all the time. By the end of the summer, I'm mostly working from home because I've just kind of fallen out of that. And then the semester starts again in the fall. And then again, I go back to the office all the time. So,
So the actual habit is really not going to the stand, frequently. That's the habit.
Or, there's like these two equilibria, and like we've kind of gotten you to jump to this other one, but it's a fragile one because it hasn't been with you for so long. That could be a way to model this, that there's like a cost of switching, and that cost of switching to a different equilibrium is bigger the longer you've been in that equilibrium, right? Could be one idea. But of course, this is something I think like for future work that this opens up to.
Thank you, Supreet.
So, Supreet, I guess you don't have the variation in the number of years these people have gone to the stand because you're selecting them to be 10 plus, right? Because one of the testable implication would be, given that this is actually, easier to change if it's just an habit is formed within a year, then, those people should have more persistent behavior and the other ones should have less because their original equilibrium is the 4 days and so on. So you
That's
don't, I
so
don't think you have that variation, right?
we do. So the
Okay.
average been there for 10 plus years, but we have variation. I think what I just have to think about is like, do we have enough variation? Do we have enough people who are very small? Because if you think about it, like 7 weeks, would 4 years versus 5 years be a
Yeah, agreed.
if the treatment is 7 weeks? So we can look at that, but I'm skeptical we'll have enough people who've only been there for like less than a year where you might think 7 weeks is meaningful.
And there could totally be other mechanisms that are at play when you're there for the first, like whatever, it's the first year or the first couple, the first year there, probably the mechanisms that are at play are slightly different.
But it's a great idea. We should look at that for sure.
And maybe I sort of had a somewhat related question that it's about like, so the issue here is a little bit like how much of an impulse you need in order to get persistent responses. So there is a chance that if you were to treat these people for many weeks, they would actually transition to a stable new equilibrium. So this, you could actually write another model that says, look, you're actually in the path and then it's unstable, you revert back. But if you push them enough, they're going to transition to a new equilibrium, right? So it's like the running person who's, running 2 days a week, but then at some point it gets pushed so much that the equilibrium becomes 5 days a week.
Right.
Unfortunately, you probably won't be able to say anything about that, but it is consistent, I guess, with the findings that you could actually have this transition.
Yeah, and in fact, that is the historical view of the Industrial Revolution. So kind of the Marxist view, which Bowles and Gintis have also espoused, is that really, but and others as well, other historians, that really like the advent of free public education in Europe like is what enabled workers to transition from being irregular workers to like good factory workers. Like Marx thought this is like just training the proletariat to be like docile workers. You show up when the bell rings, you sit still, you raise your hand, like schooling trained people to be kind of docile workers. And that's what led to this transition. It was very important socially. And if you look at developing countries, average attendance rate in secondary school is 50%. 50% of kids are not in secondary school, right? When you show up, so people just haven't built that habit of regularity. And so then when they're 30, you can't expect them to go get a factory job.
David, you want to take the last question before we close? Just have to unmute yourself. David, just need to unmute yourself. Well, I guess maybe that's not happening. So
I'll have my Zoom room in 15 minutes. I open a Zoom room, right? Is that
you want to take a break for 15 minutes and then you open it up later?
No, I'll just go straight into it. So I'll just go into the Zoom room now.
Perfect.
And then
the link is there. Everyone who wants to join Supreet, maybe Heather as well. That's the link. It's in the chat. So just click on that. Let me thank Supreet and Heather for being here. Thank you so much for a fascinating paper. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here. We'll see each other, or some of us, in a couple of weeks with Yin Yang. It's great. Thank you so much, and bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Goodbye.